I've been around this neighborhood my whole entire life. So when Rebecca had recommended that we did an author's talk with you, and told me about your former book, it just was like we gotta read this book. So so before we get into the book, I think it's appropriate that we introduce ourselves. And we wanted you to kind of start off introducing yourself and your books and any other book that you have written.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, guys, it's such a pleasure to be here. And I'm excited about the prospect of the bookstore that you guys are hoping to open. So I'm Alex Kotlowitz. I'm a author and journalist. I've been working in this craft for some 40 years. And much of my work is about writing about people who are trying to stand erect in a world that's slumping around them. And I feel like one of the ways to take measure of where we are as a country is to sort of understand those who've been pushed aside into the margins. And my first book is a book called There Are No Children Here, in which I spent a couple of years following two young boys living in a public housing complex. And my most recent book, which I think is kind of as a bookend to There Are No Children Here, is An American Summer, which is a collection of stories about people in Chicago who have been touched by the city's violence. And we can talk about this, but I was looking for stories that surprised me, that knocked me off balance, that made me think about our city, about race, about poverty, about the violence in a different way. And so I write books. I do some writing for the New Yorker and for This American Life, the radio show. I do some film. I did a documentary 8 years ago called The Interrupters, about three violence interrupters in the city. And I also teach nonfiction writing at Northwestern. And I'm not a native Chicagoan. I'm from New York originally. I'm kind of an accidental Chicagoan, but goddamn, I love this city. I've been here for 45 years now.
Well, that is very interesting. Alex, my name is Iesha Malone. I am a fifth grade ELA teacher. I've been teaching for about 10 years now. And I am a current entrepreneur. I am the owner and co-founder of Rose Café, which is a up and coming bookstore that we're trying to bring some literacy into the neighborhoods for various reasons. And then Rebecca's going to talk about her a little bit.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Silverman. I'm a former elementary school teacher. I taught with Iesha. Sorry, we call each other Miss Silverman and Miss Malone. I always catch myself. I taught with Iesha for 3 years, and now I'm in school studying education policy. And I am the co-founder of Rose Café.
So creative director of Rose Cafe. So the invitations and a lot of the things we do on social media that is inspired by Rebecca.
So now, just to be clear, is Rose Cafe opened or not yet?
So we are open. We don't have our brick and mortar. We are selling books currently online. Like right now, we so if those who wanted to purchase your book, we sell the book, all published books on our online site. Right now, these efforts that we are doing is to raise money to open the brick and mortar.
Right. Okay.
So that's exactly where we're at right now.
Okay. Well, you guys let me know when you're open because I'll be there.
Perfect.
We are family now, Alex. So we want to work together with a lot of the things that you're doing. And I'm curious, since we have introduced ourselves, I wanted to kind of talk about the summer of 2013.
Yeah. So the book takes place in that summer, and it was a fairly arbitrary summer. I mean, to be perfectly frank, it was when I began the book, and I was looking. I mean, one of the things I've learned the hard way is that reporting can be really messy, and so I looked for some boundaries, and so I wanted a period of time. So I chose this one summer, and to be truthful about it, it wasn't in for Chicago. It was a reasonably good summer, but having said that, it was still a summer in which we saw a good deal of violence. I think we had the city by the end of the year reported some 450 murders, certainly not as bad as this year. But what I wanted to do again was to really sort of take measure of the impact of the violence, both on the spirit of individuals and the spirit of community.
In the book you talked, you introduced a lot of characters, but you also introduced community. I wanted to kind of talk about one particular incident where we had a character who was supported by Mercy Homes.
Yeah, right.
And so when I was reading about the character and when he went to court, how the resolution was because the community was there to support him.
Right.
And I kind of wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about what we lack in the community that can probably help us in these systems,
Right.
and ways from your perspective how we can get that community support for those children that need it.
Yeah, I mean, Aisha, you're absolutely right, and it's a kind of a really keen observation. So this is a story about a young boy, Marcelo, and I met Marcelo when he was 17 years old, and he was a kid who grew up on the Southwest side and walked this really a tightrope. You know, he on the one hand he ran with a local street gang, but on the other hand, he was a straight A student at a top parochial school in the city. And he didn't quite know where he belonged. And when he was 16 years old, he ran into some rival gang members, and he got shot 2 times in the leg. And he would have been killed had the police not showed up and the gun jammed. And I think Marcelo realized at that point that if he was going to move on, that he physically had to remove himself from the neighborhood. He recognized that. He was a really smart kid. In fact, his friends at school used to call him the stupid smart kid, which I think was kind of an apt moniker for him then. And he got himself, as you say, into this place, Mercy Home for Boys and Girls, which is this kind of a jewel of a place. Most people don't know about it. It's on the near west side. It's been around for almost 100 years. It's changed considerably in the past 10 years or so, and it's a place that takes in kids who are struggling in one manner or another. And what I really admire about it is 2 things. One is they recognize if they take the kids in, they've got to not only work with the kid, but also work with their family, which seems so essential. And the other thing is they're really keen on grappling with the trauma that these kids have faced. And that was certainly the case with Marcelo. And Marcelo moves into Mercy. He excels. He's getting straight A's, and at the end of his junior year, he goes home for the weekend and hangs out with some friends. And on a Saturday morning, after a night of drinking, they go out and they rob 3 people of their cell phones. And it was fairly violent. They didn't have weapons, but they used their fists, and he quickly got arrested. And they placed a $300,000 bond. I mean, it was a really outrageous bond. I mean, the bond system in the city has long been kind of very arbitrary, and I think we're moving in the right direction with it. But that's the kind of bond that you would find placed on somebody who had committed, attempted murder. And as you say, fortunately, Marcelo had not only his family, but this community behind him. You know, the people at Mercy, his teachers at De La Salle, and they all came and testified in court and were able to get the bond reduced. And so that's when I first met Marcelo, was that day in the courtroom. And so I spent the next year and a half with Marcelo. He was on house arrest, which for me was fortunate because I knew where to find him all the time. And I'd go over almost every Sunday. And I'd bring over a sandwich, we'd have lunch, we'd play chess, and then we'd sit around and talk. And Marcelo is this incredibly thoughtful, reflective young man. I mean, he was incredibly remorseful about what he did. And so his story is about sort of the story of this young man trying to find his way with the help, as you say, of community. And in this case, his community, his most immediate community, was the people at Mercy. And I don't want to give too much away, but
I don't. As you talk, I'm like, everything the gun.
I know. But I gotta say, because I love Marcelo, he's doing so well, and I'm gonna give away part of the book, but I'm sorry I can't help myself because I'm so proud of him. But he enrolled at DePaul, he graduated, he's working at a bank. He's got a son. He's now about a year old. He got married his teenage sweetheart, and he's just doing really well.
I have so many questions, but I know that Rebecca has some as well. Go ahead, Rebecca.
No, we were just curious, like speaking of Marcelo and his, individual story, how you found people to talk to and how you picked the stories that you chose for the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I felt for like 2 months when I began this book, I felt like I was a chicken running around without its head. I wasn't quite sure where I wasn't exactly clear what I was looking for, but I knew that when I found it, I would know it. And really, in the end, what I was looking for were stories that, again, were going to surprise me, that were going to knock me off balance. And the other part of it, which is I just know this instinctually, I was looking for people that I wanted to spend time with, because I knew if I wanted to spend time with them, or hoped if I wanted to spend time with them, then readers would want to spend time with them. And so there were various ways. Marcelo's story I actually found from, oh God, I can't believe our lieutenant governor's name just escaped me. Help me here. Anyway, she used to work in Preckwinkle's office, but they were very upset about the arbitrariness of the bonds. And so I had learned about that, and they knew about Marcelo's story. That's what upset them about Marcelo's story. And the more I got into it, the bond, his high bond was a small part of the story. And as I got to know Marcelo, I realized, and I didn't know what the outcome of his story was going to be. And so I just spent that year and a half with them. There were others, there's a man in the book, a dear friend, Eddie Bocanegra, who I knew before writing the book. And then there were others who I just met through friends. I embedded with a homicide unit on the South Side. I ended up not writing about it, but I found stories that way. I spent time at the trauma unit over at County at Stroger. I was just really just talking to everybody I could, looking for stories and trying to understand the impact of the violence.
The detail of the book kind of says that people talked back, right? Because you are very explicit in how you describe your encounters. And so we were wondering, because you're in a neighborhood with a lot of minorities. So for them to trust you, how did that come about? Because it was very personal. And if you could talk to that.
Yeah, no, Iesha, it's a really fair question. The book is deeply intimate, and so a couple of things. One, I try to be as open and straightforward with people as I can about what I'm doing and what my intent is. And I think one of the questions that people always ask themselves at the beginning is, why should I tell my story? Why should I share it with you? And moreover, share it in this incredibly public way. And so, I try to talk with people about that. Sometimes it's to right or wrong. Sometimes it's because nobody's come along and asked them about their lives. Sometimes it's because they feel if they can tell their story, it might have an impact on others like them. And then with each of the people in the book, I spent weeks, if not months, some of them even a couple of years, talking to them periodically, meeting with them. And I try, and I fail on occasion, but I try as best I can to make sure that there's nothing in the end in the book that will surprise them. I try to be as open as I can about what I'm doing and what my intentions are.
I think that's interesting. It's something that Iesha and I talk about a lot, that I know like my friends and family think that because I have friends that are Black, or I taught in a school that was majority Black, like I know everything about everything. And that I don't think people realize that it's something that takes a lot of time to develop. I mean, I was with Iesha this morning and we had a disagreement. It's just something that like we work through, and it's not something that just happens and you move on. It's like it's a constant trust that develops. It's not just earned and then you move on. if that makes sense.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think, clearly race is the most profound fissure in the American landscape. But there are also other fissures as well around religion, around politics, gender. And so for me, given what I do, wherever I go, I'm always an outsider, if not by race and class, by gender, by religion. And so, and I think that Rebecca, you're right. I mean, we live in a country that likes to think that we're all in this together, and yet we lead incredibly separate lives. And so, Brian Stevenson talks about this in his book Just Mercy, but we don't have that proximity that we need to really get to know each other, and get to know each other, Rebecca, in the way that you talk about, where you can actually have arguments. You can laugh and cry with each other, and push back. And I feel like so you really, I think, at the moment in this country, have got to make an effort, a really concerted effort, if you're going to have that kind of proximity.
Is that why the title is An American Summer, Love and Death, right? So you talked about the death, but you also talked about love.
Yeah.
In one particular moment, you kind of talked about Lisa Daniels.
Yeah.
And how, because that was the chapter I cried on. And I don't know, it touched me because we had just heard about Marcelo. And then you brought in Lisa, which kind of like evened my feelings out. And I think sometimes we need that. Do you mind talking about why you put so much positivity in it with so much pain?
Yeah. Iesha, I got to be perfectly frank. It wasn't like I was looking for that, but I think it comes, but I think it comes naturally. I think you can't write about, well, in this case, you can't write about death without also writing about life. You can't write about pain without writing about love. It's not, they don't exist in isolation. I think it's one of the mistakes we often make. I think, for example, one of the things that drives me crazy, and I may be, contribute to this, I hope not, but, when we talk about, the neighborhoods in our cities that are distressed, that are predominantly neighborhoods, people of color, that we tend to think about all the deficits, and we don't look at all the strengths and the things to celebrate in these communities as well. And so in the story of Lisa Daniel, I mean, this remarkable woman who, lost her a second son. I know it was just she lost two sons, but her youngest son, when he was 25 years old, he was shot and killed in a drug deal gone awry. And what's remarkable about Lisa's story is, it's a pretty straight ahead. She thinks it's a pretty straight ahead case. They know who shot her son, and they had a drug deal. I think that neither of them came there with the best of intentions. And she thought it was just going to be that he would go to trial and get convicted and spend a long time in prison. And at one point, the state's attorney comes to her and says to her, Lisa, the defendant is claiming self-defense. This is proving a little more complicated than we anticipated. We're thinking of offering him a plea deal. Would you be okay with that? And Lisa thought about it overnight and came back and said, I would be okay with it, but the only thing I request is that I speak at his sentencing. And at sentencing, family members of the victim are allowed to give what's called a victim's impact statement. And usually that victim's impact statement speaks to how the crime has profoundly affected you and your loved ones. And Lisa spoke about that a little bit, but what she really did in that moment, and it's what's so remarkable, is she ended up forgiving the person who shot her son. I mean, she came to realize it could have just as easily been the other way around. And at one point she says, I've done everything I can to preserve the honor and dignity of my son. I'm going to do everything to preserve the honor and dignity of you, Michael Reed, the young man who killed her son. And then she asked the judge for leniency. And she ends up having a correspondence with the young man who killed her son while he's in prison. I also will say that Lisa now sits on the state parole board. this institution that's all about forgiveness. And I think she's had a profound impact on the way other members of that board think about forgiveness, think about mercy.
Okay.
That story was so powerful to me, and it really went back to the idea of love. And I really appreciate the way you showed the stories of people who were affected by both sides of gun violence.
Right.
Could you, Iesha, could you pull up the quote?
Yep.
I think it's a good segue. So this was a quote that was in the book, if you wouldn't mind reading it.
Sure. In Chicago, the vast majority of murders and shootings go unsolved. I need to move this.
Oh, do you want me to read it? Is it cut out?
Yeah, I can't see the whole.
Okay.
They're my own words. You think I'd remember them, but I some of it's blocked off. So yeah, Rebecca, you'll have to read it.
Okay. So it says, in Chicago, the vast majority of murders and shootings go unsolved. Murder someone and chances are only one in 4 that you'll get caught. Shoot someone and injure them, it's a 1 in 10 possibility that you'll get charged. That's not a misprint. You have an awfully good chance of shooting someone in the city and getting away with it. And, we were talking about that. I think it has a new meaning for me now. I read this book last year and I was rereading it this year, and it has a new meaning for me with all of the conversations around defunding the police. And when that conversation is brought up, a lot of people's first instinct is, well, what are we going to do if there's a murder? Or what are we going to do if there's a very violent crime? And then thinking about this, it's not even happening now.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's, this whole conversation around defunding the police is such an important conversation. I wish the language were different, because I think, my understanding is, I think really what people are asking is that we think about reappropriating some of our resources, and that not ask the police to do all that they do, that we recognize that there are places where, rather than have law enforcement, it makes sense to have a social worker or a counselor intervene. And for all that conversation, if I were the superintendent of the police, this is where I would put all my energy, is trying to do what the police should be doing and doing well, which is to solve violent crimes. The police will sometimes tell you that, the reason they can't solve crimes is because people won't talk to them, that there's this, no snitch culture. But the truth of the matter is, for the most part, people are afraid. And the reason they're afraid, and this is the sort of cycle, the cyclical nature of this, the reason they're afraid is they fear that the police can't protect them. And so they end up relying on others for protection. And it just kind of this spiral that sort of goes out of control. And this is where I would put all my energy. I just read that apparently this year, it's been an awful year in terms of violence in the city. And I guess the closure rate for murders, which had been going up a little bit in recent years, has suddenly gone down again. And I think we've got to address that. The other end of this equation, of course, is, what if we're able to solve crimes, then what's the appropriate punishment for people who committed violent crimes? I have spent time teaching at Stateville Correctional Center, a maximum security prison, just an hour from here. Most are violent offenders. Most of the men I teach are men in their 40s, 50s, even 60s, who have committed, violent crimes, but usually when they were quite young, teenagers, maybe early 20s. And these are guys who, I think, personally, the people I've taught should be now given a second chance. They, clearly are men who have this second act in life. And I don't know that they're different people than they were when they were young, but they're certainly, I think, sort of have figured out who they are, who they really are. So it's a complicated I mean, calculus, but I do think that, again, if I were the superintendent of police, this is where I would focus my energies.
And so this conversation is going so well. This probably feel like the quickest interview we've done because we have 5 minutes left, and it's like two important things I wanted to ask you, but I don't know which one is more important than the other. As you journeyed over the summer, you got through an entire summer going through all of this, right? But then you talked about the news reporter who was like done with it after one night. He like, you know what, this is enough. He started taking medication and things like that. I have to know, how did you get so resilient and to like can bear all of these stories without, I don't want to say give up, but without like saying, you know what, this is enough.
Yeah. So if I'm being perfectly frank, Aisha, this was a really hard book in the reporting. Now I've talked about this before, so I'm not revealing anything. And I feel a little uncomfortable talking about it only because I feel like whatever pain I've had is minimal compared to the kind of pain that people I met have experienced. But there was a period in reporting this book that I fell into a kind of what I would think of as now in hindsight as a kind of clinical depression. I mean, I just really had a hard time I realize now that in hindsight is I was experiencing this kind of secondary trauma. And as school teachers, I'm sure you guys are well familiar with this. This kind of secondary or vicarious trauma where you experience a kind of PTSD because of the trauma of those around you. I think what kind of pulled me through, well, one, I had the catharsis of being able to tell their stories. But the other part was the people I met, the Lisa Daniels, the Marcellos, the Eddie Bocanegras, people who I so deeply admire and who have suffered considerably worse and whose pain has been considerably more profound. And yet I look at how they are not only moving forward, but moving forward heroically. And I mean, I know this may sound facile, but it was an inspiration, and it's what pulled me through. And Aisha, this goes back, I think, to your earlier point, which is, I think, in the end, what's so important is community. It's what got me through, my community of friends.
Silverman, did you want to ask your last question that before? Because we can go over a little bit because this is good.
Yeah. So I was curious when I was talking to Iesha about the book initially. I think that it has different people read it coming from different lenses. So Iesha read it coming from a different place than I did growing up in the suburbs versus her growing up in Roseland. And we were just wondering if you like how you hold that your voice just as a white man holds so much power. And I think it brings in more people to be interested into this topic. And did you feel that, or, I don't know how to end this question.
Yeah, I think the part of the question too, you're not asking sort of my place in telling these stories as well as a white man. Let me just go back. So I spent 10 years writing at the Wall Street Journal. This is back in the 80s and early 90s. And I was writing about these very issues that I'm still writing about today. And I have no question that part of the reason I was able to write the stories I did, and part of the reason why editors back then trusted me was because I was white, because I was not from these communities. I have no doubt about it. And I have no doubt too that part of the success of my first book, There Are No Children Here, had everything to do with the fact that I was a white author. This speaks, it's testament to where we are as a nation, that somehow people would listen to me. I think things have changed some since then. I look now at the incredible array of incredibly powerful Black voices writing, at least in my craft, writing nonfiction. I think of Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think of Jelani Cobb, I think of Nicole Hannah-Jones. And so what I contribute, I hope, is sort of what I am as a storyteller. And I think it's really important to tell stories. And especially to tell stories of those who've been pushed along the margins. And my feeling is in the end that I've got two options. I go out into the world and I sort of hear what I hear and I see what I see, and I can remain quiet, which I feel would be complicit, or I could give voice to what I witness. And that's what I try to do. And I guess for me, the real question that I think people should ask of me and ask of themselves, have I done it in a way that reflects honestly the fullness and richness and complexity of the people that I'm writing about? I feel like that's what I strive for. But I think it's the question really that, if I were a reader, that I want to be asking of me.
Well, Alex, I really enjoyed the book. It was a host of emotions that I went through. I'm definitely going to recommend the book. And I want to thank you for taking the time out to walk in. And I don't know if that's a good term, to walk in someone else's shoes and tell the story of it, because sometimes it's heard differently.
Yeah.
Right. So I do want to thank you for that.
Well, thanks, Iesha. Rebecca, thanks. And I'm serious, when that bookstore opens, I'm going to be one of the first ones down
Be
there.
serious.
We'll definitely let you know. I also wanted to say thank you because we're so excited to talk to you, and there are no children here. I'm sure you hear this a lot, but it really inspired me to want to become a teacher. It was so influential to me reading. So thank you so much for your work.
Thanks. Well, thanks, guys. I love this. This is a great time. Let's hope for a good outcome tomorrow.
A good